So the topic for today is intensive property and extensive property. This will lead on to like colligative properties. We'll go forward with colligative properties. यो दुईटा पढेपछि it'll be easier to understand colligative properties. So when we go to intensive properties, so when we talk about intensive properties, we are talking about defining some quantities, right? Defining some quantities. When we talk about intensive and extensive properties, we are trying to define a particular quantity with certain amount of freedom, right? So we want के दियो भने चाहिँ के particular value दियो भने चाहिँ can I define some property or not. So if I give you like mass, so with mass can you define something, with temperature can you define something, with heat can you define something. So these two properties are basically the way, or the like, two broad ways in which you can define materials or properties, right? So if I say intensive properties are properties that do not depend upon the quantity. So any property that does not depend upon the quantity of the material present is known as an intensive property. So अगर कुनै चिज intensive छ, कुनै चिज something is under the intensive property column, which means that those quantities do not require a quantity. If you understand the analogy, it's very simple. So if you don't need the amount of the material to define something, that is an intensive property. Like a simple example is temperature, right? So you don't need like 5 kilogram of something to exactly find the temperature, right? You can have a very small piece of something and still find the temperature of that body. You can have a very large body and still find the temperature of that body. So intensive properties are basically properties that do not depend upon the quantity of matter present in the system. So this is what is given in the book. So exactly the words in the book is the properties which do not depend upon the quantity of matter present in the system are called intensive properties. So if it doesn't depend on the quantity of matter, so matter is anything that has shape, weight, can be touched, anything. So if you go to the basic definition of matter, so if the properties does not depend upon the quantity of matter, then those kind of properties are known as intensive properties. So I give you an example, temperature. So there are more examples in the book: temperature, density, concentration, specific heat, viscosity. So viscosity is also one thing. You know what's viscosity, right? So viscosity is basically friction in liquid, right? So friction in liquid. So by viscosity, you can define how thick or thin a liquid is, right? You can like say that water is a very least viscous, one of the least viscous liquids, right? Water is one of the least viscous liquid. Viscosity of water is very less. It's very thin. It doesn't take like a lot of time to flow. It flows readily, right? But honey, in the other case, in the opposite spectrum, we have honey, which is a highly viscous liquid, right? It's very thick, right? And it requires some time to flow. So honey is a highly viscous liquid, and water is one of the least viscous liquids. So by viscosity, when you define viscosity of a liquid, you don't go for the amount of liquid, right? You don't need one glass of water to define viscosity of water, right? You just need water. It can be any amount of water. You can have a glass full of water, you can have a tank full of water, it doesn't matter, right? Viscosity will be defined, is self-sufficient. It can like self-sufficiently define itself, not by the quantity but by the material, right? So you can define the viscosity of any liquid by a small amount of liquid, right? You don't need a large amount of liquid. You don't depend upon the quantity. So those kind of properties are known as intensive properties. Very important thing. So you should know about this very clearly. And the other kind of property is known as the extensive property. So extensive property भनेको चाहिँ the properties that need matter, right? That depends upon the quantity of matter to define a particular property. So the properties which depend upon the quantity of matter in a system is known as an extensive property, right? Like for example, mass. Very simple and very straightforward example, mass. So to define mass, you'll need quantity of something. You'll need some quantity of cotton to define 1 kilo of it, right? 1 kilo of cotton will require some amount of cotton, some definite amount of cotton, right? You can't have like 1 kg of cotton here will not be less than 1 kg of cotton somewhere else, right? It'll be exactly the same, right? You'll need a certain amount of cotton to define the mass of cotton, right? So that is known as an extensive property. So another example given here is mole. So this is also one of the common things that we have been studying. So moles भनेको के हो? So moles भनेको, my definition of moles, very simple definition of mole is GMM of anything, GMM of any element. So if you have the gram molecular mass of any element, so let's say gram molecular mass of hydrogen is 1. If you have 1 gram of hydrogen, that is basically 1 mole of hydrogen. So for mole as well, we need a specific amount of mass. So because now 1 gram of hydrogen is not like 1 gram of every other element is not 1 mole. So 1 gram of oxygen is not equal to 1 mole of oxygen, right? So you have to have 16 grams of oxygen to make 1 mole, right? So moles मा जुन mass use हुन्छ, that mass actually makes mole to be an extensive property. Since we have mass, the term mass inside mole, right? The most common term inside mole is mass. Because of that, like presence of mass in it, we have the mole to be an extensive property. So very simple. So intensive properties are properties that do not depend upon the quantity of matter. So they just depend upon the matter. They just depend upon the particle or element or whatever it is. But they do not depend upon the amount of matter it's present there, right? An extensive property is just the opposite of it. It depends upon the amount of matter present. So mass will depend on amount of matter that is present in a particular thing to find the mass of it, right? Similarly mole, so to find the mole of any element, you'll need the mass of that element, right? You'll need the gram molecular mass of that element. So that is mole. So and that is extensive property in general. So there's a table in the book. I don't think you have this book, but still, temperature is an intensive property because you don't need anything to define temperature. You don't need any matter. You have concentration of any liquid. So a liquid मा कति salt हालेको छु मैले. So what is the concentration of salt inside that liquid? So that is an intensive property. I don't need the mass of the liquid, right? I just need a sample of the liquid. That's it. Viscosity, as explained earlier. Then extensive mass, number of moles. Then energy is extensive property. Yes, because we know the famous world famous equation E equal to mc square. Because of the relation of energy with mass, we have to always relate energy with mass. And since it is related to mass being an extensive property, energy will also become an extensive property. So there is no way of like defining energy without mass. So even though we are not exposed to this relation, we should always have in our mind that energy and mass are always interconvertible. You can always convert mass to energy, or you can always convert energy to mass. So that is always a possibility, right? So this is intensive property and the extensive property. So now we'll move forward to colligative properties. So this is the main focus for today's class. So colligative properties. So yeah. So colligative properties. So what are colligative properties? So it's a little bit tricky, but the definition is straightforward. So colligative property भनेको के हो भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ, colligative properties are properties that depend upon the number of solute or amount of solute. Let's not number, let's say amount of solute, that depend upon the amount of solute in a solution. Yeah, but it does not depend on the chemical properties of it. So colligative properties भनेको, these are those properties which depend upon the amount of solute that is present in a solution. It will be affected, or it will be like something will happen if you mess with this part of the solution. If you mess with the solute part, if you mess with the amount of solute present in a solution, that will in turn have an effect on the colligative properties. But if you change the chemical properties of the solute, right, if you like go on changing the chemical properties of the solute, it will not affect the colligative properties. So colligative properties are those properties which depend upon the amount of solute in a solution, but it is independent of the chemical properties of it. So in the book it's written, the properties of solutions which depend upon the number of solute particles or amount of solute particles in a definite amount of solvent but not on the chemical nature of the solute are called colligative properties. So very simple. So colligative properties are basically the properties of solutions that do depend upon the amount of solute in a definite amount of solvent or in a solution, but they do not depend upon the chemical properties of it. So these are not straightforward properties. Like if I say intensive properties, so when I say intensive properties, you can easily come up with an intensive property. Like I said earlier, right? Intensive property but temperature. So anyone could guess that temperature is an intensive property because you don't need mass, you don't need like matter for measuring the temperature, right? You just need the amount. Temperature is just a measure of heat present in a body, right? So whether it's cold or it's hot. So so you can come to a like logical conclusion when I say intensive property, and then when I define intensive property, you can always come to a logical conclusion that some like daily, the term that is used daily can be an intensive property, like the temperature thing. We use the temperature thing almost daily, right? And there can be an intensive property, you can guess it. But colligative properties are not like that, so you can't guess a colligative property. That there are 4 definite colligative properties that we have to remember anyhow. Okay, so the next topic will be on the 4 different colligative properties that we need to know. So before that, we'll have some doubt session.